Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm excited to be with y'all today. I'm excited to have electricity and water to be able to be with y'all today. As Bethany mentioned, we did have this that happened here last week, and I know for myself and for our paralegal, that's a part of our MLP, we both just kind of got fully restored as of last night. So it's going to be a while in terms of our recovery, but I am going to talk a little bit more about that with you all today. So I'm excited. Here is my information. I'm a staff attorney in our medical legal partnership at Texas Legal Services Center. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. And TLSC general. Our firm is a nonprofit law firm, not a part of legal aid, but we do provide free legal services for Texans all across the state. This is our firm's mission statement, and it's been newly revised, I think, to reflect more accurately what we do and convey that, you know, the law affects so many areas of our lives, and we want to make sure that that is achieved equitably among all Texans. This is the structure of our medical legal partnership. Our law firm is sort of the hub for the attorneys and paralegals, and then we partner. Right now, we have 3 different clinic partners, and each of these partners actually has multiple locations. I started in 2017 at the People's Community Clinic Center for Women's Health with an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. And last year moved down to Houston to help start our new partnership with Hope Clinic here. So as Bethany mentioned, and I mentioned before too, we had this crisis last week. So I'm going to go on a bit of a rant or tangent. I don't know if anyone has coined that word, but that's what this is going to be, because we are going to be talking about local ordinances as it relates to housing and the pandemic. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that the foundation on which all of this lies is really systemic and structural racism. So the picture that you're seeing is from a hotel in downtown Austin that was taken last week during the snowstorm. I've heard it called grid event. My personal favorite is Snowvid 21. So it's been referred to as all of these things, but I think it's important to mention that the snow and the storm is not what caused the issues that we have here in Texas. These issues have been caused by inequities in how utilities are administered here across the state. This picture from Austin, in it you can really see kind of the inequity in how the power was distributed last week, and this actually aligns perfectly with the history of Austin. Going back to the 1920s, non-white, in particular Black people, were zoned to live in a particular part of the city, and that's the part that we actually see that's dark in this picture. They were zoned to live in that particular part in order to receive any types of city services, utilities, school, you know, for children to go to schools, to, you know, if folks did receive mortgages, for them to have mortgages, they had to be living in a certain part of the city. And so as the city has grown, we've seen that the inequity has grown right along with it. And, you know, just as of last week, we still continue to see that. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this is the foundation that we're building on when we're talking about these local ordinances. And this is also the power that we have with local ordinances. And so there we have, I think, also an opportunity to begin to create some change, but it starts with acknowledging the history. So yes, that was a snowstorm, but we're still in a pandemic. And so that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today, what's happened in the pandemic in terms of housing. I'm going to focus on evictions, but also going to talk about utility shutoffs and habitability. So when we talk about evictions, there are quite a few issues that we saw starting right at the beginning of the pandemic. One of the main things, and again, the problems that I list here are not an exhaustive list, but sort of ways that we saw things start to spiral. So the main first problem that we started to see was a loss of income for folks who were affected by extreme shutdowns and stay-at-home orders here across the state. And just to emphasize again, I'm using Texas as the case study, but you can be thinking about what happened in your area. I'd love to hear about ways that you've come up to address some of these issues. But one of the main ones we saw here, as I'm sure a lot of you saw, was loss of income. And so folks were unable to pay for housing costs, and that ultimately, leads to, under normal circumstances, an inability to remain housed. And with the pandemic, we see the additional issues of, folks being unable to maintain like hand washing and hygiene and things like that if they were to lose housing. So one of the main protections that we saw come into play here were eviction moratoria or eviction bans. We saw this on the federal level through the CARES Act. And here in Texas, we had a statewide eviction ban. And then the city of Austin and Travis County, where Austin is located, also had some eviction bans. We also saw some rent assistance programs come into play. I think it's also important to note that was one of the issues we saw. The loss of income occurred early on because of shutdowns, but then as we started to progress through the pandemic and as COVID has spread more throughout the population, we also have the issue of folks getting infected and getting sick and having to take off of work or have to care for loved ones who are sick. So the problems really just compounded here. And so I'll show you a few numbers in just a moment to show you how these local moratoria actually helped. So what I want to show you is the numbers between, so we're going to look at Austin, Fort Worth, and Houston, the numbers of eviction filings. Austin did have, like I mentioned, the local moratoria, but Fort Worth and Houston did not. So we did have the state eviction ban as well that the Supreme Court of Texas issued early on in the pandemic, but that actually expired in the middle of April, and there was nothing else to protect people. So at that point, there were the CARES Act eviction protections, which are a little cumbersome and also don't apply to everyone. And then if there was no local protections, that was kind of just it. So the article that I pulled for these numbers was published January 28th. But I think for the numbers that we'll see for Fort Worth and Houston, a lot of those filings happened between when the state protections expired and when the CDC eviction moratorium was instituted, because that one was a lot more protective. So for Austin during this time frame, there were 818 evictions filed. For Fort Worth, which is similar in size, a little bit smaller actually, there were 11,841 eviction cases filed. And then in Houston, which is much larger, 22,357 evictions filed. This is all in the middle of the pandemic. So this continues to be a challenge. I think a lot of it was helped with the federal CDC moratorium. But again, we're looking at that possibly, expiring in 5 weeks now. So, I'd love to hear kind of some of the things that y'all have done, or if y'all have had any local moratoria that have been effective. And this is the main area where I've been practicing and on the ground. I think I've been, maybe almost every day. I've worked since the pandemic has begun. I've gotten questions about housing and paying rent and landlords that are bullying people. And so this has definitely been a challenging part of the practice since the pandemic. As Bethany mentioned, I also want to talk about utility shutoffs. I got the opportunity, along with my colleagues early on in the pandemic, to draft a petition to the Public Utilities Commission of Texas think last week we all learned more than we ever wanted to know about electricity in Texas. It's very complicated. It's not regulated, so people in different cities and different areas, there's all types of different rules and protections available. But for this particular petition that we were able to draft, and using our unique lens as MLP attorneys, we were able to focus on the importance of considering health in this particular policy. We were able to impact about 1 million Texans and ensure that they were able to have their utilities turned on, and not stopped for non-payment of rent during the pandemic. Unfortunately, this expired in October, but interestingly enough, we're seeing some of the same types of protections come back around now after Snowvid 21. That's what I'll refer to last week's event, as we're seeing some similar protections come back around. And again, because it's such a patchwork piecemeal system, this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone in Texas, but it certainly does have a significant impact. The last kind of main area I wanted to focus on in terms of housing is habitability. Here in Texas, renters have rights to maintain safe housing, and there are certain procedures they can follow if their landlords are not willing to do that. But unfortunately, in order to exercise their rights, they have to be caught up on rent. I'm curious to know if this is the same thing in other states, but that's an issue we've been running into here. This is an area where I'm not really sure how to best help and serve folks. I think we talked about this on our last learning collaborative, which was really helpful, and I know other people were running into the same issue. So I'd love to hear today if y'all have any feedback on ways to help our patient clients in this position, to help them advocate for themselves, potentially, because this is a serious issue. Even though we have a lot of people that are able to remain housed, even though they're not paying rent, that doesn't necessarily mean the housing is safe. And so the pandemic seems to be going on, and likely will be going on for the remainder of this year. So this will become a more pressing issue, especially considering here with the storms last week, potential damage, burst pipes and things like that caused to properties. So I just want to leave you with a couple of strategies or a couple of ways that practically things that I've done to try to help folks, and ways that I've talked to some colleagues about, about helping and implementing into our MLP practice. So the first thing is using the local moratoria that are in place. It may sound pretty simple, but this really changes the pace of our practice when the applicable laws and rules are changing on a monthly, sometimes weekly basis, and are coming from maybe 3 or 4 different sources. It definitely changes the pace and the tempo of practice, but it's important to know that these are resources that are available for us and for our patient clients. I've had the unique opportunity of practicing both in Austin and in Houston this past year during this time. So it's been interesting to see how the local moratoria there have really helped renters. But I've also been able to use some of the same arguments in Houston where there have been no local protections, especially in that time period before the CDC eviction ban went into place. It seemed to be an effective strategy to use, these other bans as sort of an argument in equity and saying, hey, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There are so many reasons why a person should not be evicted at this time. And depending on the judge, some of them are amenable to hearing that type of argument. So I think it's worth it to be creative and try to use these strategies, even if there aren't local moratoria or bans in place. Another part of my practice that I try to be pretty consistent with is just, I don't want to say empowering people, but really helping folks, recognizing and respecting the power that my patient clients already have, and helping them to be able to use that. So one way is with the local moratoria, really giving them the information and encouraging them to, assert that with their landlords, or at least letting them know that especially if they're in a rental contract, that they have just as much standing, and just as many rights as the landlord does, even if they haven't been able to pay rent. So I try to encourage in that way. But we had, with the November elections, there were some really unique opportunities to let folks know that the people that are creating these eviction bans are folks that we vote for. I know sometimes my patient clients don't necessarily see how these local elections impact our lives directly, but with the pandemic, I think we've all been able to see how officials at the federal, state, and local levels affect us directly. And so that's an opportunity to just let folks know, hey, here's what's going on. Here's how it can affect your housing. A really cool thing that happened in Austin last year was the city rerouting funds from law enforcement to provide housing support. This actually just had the vote from the city council actually happened a few weeks ago, but the city of Austin is going to purchase 2 vacant hotels to provide permanent supportive housing for folks that are unhoused in Austin. So this is a direct impact on housing that was caused from Austin citizens' civic engagement. Also, direct advocacy when you have the opportunity with local authorities. There sometimes may be opportunities to meet with local officials or judges and let them know what's going on the ground, and talk about what types of policies would be helpful for folks, for renters, but also just help to make things in the courts more smooth and efficient, and when it comes to implementing some of these eviction bans. And then also, of course, as your organizational funding constraints allow, legislative education and advocacy is always a way to help your clients. And also it's a way that we can collaborate with our healthcare partners and kind of look at broader issues that affect our patient client population and ways that we can help. So I think we're going to be on to the next part of the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Daphne. I'm going to switch back up here so that we go back to the screen share and can begin to engage with the audience. I've got, going to see, Daphne, if hopefully this all works. And I'll get the right slides to show up. All right. Here we go. All right, thanks for bearing with me, everyone. I'm advancing my slides here, and then I'm going to pull up the chat as well. All right, so April put into the chat box that folks should feel free to, type their questions and comments. And Daphne, throughout her presentation, also, really candidly asked folks to continue to share some feedback for her on issues that we know continue to play out throughout the country, like habitability issues. Several folks also put into the chat box what they're seeing on the ground with regards to avoiding or trying to get around that non-payment of rent moratoria that's put into place, whether it's because of the CDC or at the local level, and landlords are somehow, as they continue to always find some way to get around things. Daphne, I'm going to read some of these comments out to see if you have any initial reactions, and then we'll transition to, and I'll just remind folks, please feel free. This is still a learning collaborative where you are able to engage live. And so you do have the ability to hit the microphone or just hover over your camera, hit the unmute button. That way you can ask Daphne a question live. So let me just share this first. It comes from Janet Kelly in Honolulu, where she's seeing cases for eviction proceed for breach of other rental agreement claims to get around non-payment moratorium. Daphne, any thoughts that you want to share there in terms of what you've seen, you and your colleagues do to work through some of those issues. You explained that in Texas, the court really stepped in first, but once that was over, you know, the gates were wide open for probably a lot of what Janet is talking about as well.
For sure. Yeah, we've definitely seen that. Almost all of these eviction bans include exceptions for tenants that are causing, you know, harm to themselves or other tenants or things like that. And so that is definitely something we've seen landlords use to try to, you know, file and get into court. Also, with other rental obligations, I had one client who was holding over, so the landlord decided to just terminate their lease in the middle of the pandemic. And so it's interesting because that type of rental breach is not explicitly covered. Initially, it was in some of the local bans, but they actually have gotten a little, I guess that would be more restrictive in terms of the type of evictions that are covered. But it's interesting that we haven't really seen the courts where these local moratoria are in place. I haven't really seen the courts move forward with a lot of evictions, even when landlords are making these claims. The courts are really seeing through a lot of those. And usually the argument that we make, and what someone mentioned in the comments, is that that's just kind of a pretext to get someone out.
All right. And next question for you, and then I'll ask one of our attendees, Didi, if she could actually share some of what she's experiencing on the ground as well. One of our questions comes from Anjanette Frias. Anjanette, I don't know if you want to unmute to be able to add on to this, but the question posed is, have you had success with templates for physicians encountering patients with utility shutoffs?
Hi, I'm happy to expand on my question. I'm just kind of curious if, especially in Texas, where I've heard about the extreme rise in the utility costs and the amount of people that are on automatic pay. Have you utilized the physicians at all, or either in the past or currently, with templates that they can use when they encounter a patient, kind of to be an indirect, kind of a clinical, talking about clinical advocacy or clinical effect, so that they can help those patients on a broader base than, you know, one or two attorneys? That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because we do tend to work closely with our healthcare provider partners in housing issues. I don't recall using a template in particular for utility shutoffs. Often, I think because we just sort of directly get involved with that. But I have a colleague that I don't know if I kind of don't want to put her on the spot, but I will. I gave her a little bit of a heads up. Her name is Cassie, and she, I think, has worked a little bit more with the utility issues. So I would actually invite her to speak if, Cassie, if you're able to jump in.
Yeah, so I actually, we haven't done any templates for the medical legal partnership at Peoples, but I did send out a clinic-wide email to all the providers and staff to let them know which specific utility companies have the moratoria, right? Because it doesn't necessarily apply to Austin Energy, but Austin Energy and other utility companies have issued statements that have said, you know, you're not going to be getting outrageous bills, like I'm sure some of you have seen headlines in the news. So while we're not using templates, I feel like we are keeping the clinic informed with the staff-wide emails. And then I have gotten a little bit of questions back from staff and providers about when those moratoria apply and what service zones utility companies cover. So that's kind of where we're at with it. And then they're advised that if affected patients, you know, are having difficulty navigating the utility system, we have resources with community health workers, and then we're able to handle legal issues if they refer to us.
Thanks for jumping in, Cassie. Appreciate it.